I'm Benjamin Bryant, and this is the BZcast. From Donald Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions to Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, everybody's talking about it. It's leaking, or is it whistleblowing? We'll find out on today's BZcast. Leaking. It's no doubt been the source of debate, praise, and division going back as far as mass communication itself. But it's been a particularly relevant topic in the American political conversation for as long as any of us can remember, and then some. Leaking has been the match that lit some of the greatest political fires in history, while in other cases it simply provided the gasoline to keep them burning. Leaks, particularly those coming from inside the halls of government, can, in theory, expose wrongdoing that might otherwise never see the light of day and drive change that we can all agree on. But that's not always how it plays out. Leaks are frequently deployed to embarrass or take down political opponents, and many have argued that leaks, especially those that are salacious in nature, actually do more public harm than good. Many seem to agree that leaks fall into the whistleblowing category, often protected by law, and that those are most acceptable, but not all do. And how do we tell the difference between whistleblowing and a plain old leak anyway? With President Donald Trump and Attorney General Jeff Sessions taking a very strong position against leaking, and some might argue against whistleblowing itself, going so far as to announce new or stepped up investigations into past instances of both, while the White House also cites information gained through leaks to support the president's positions, the whole matter can get confusing fast, particularly for federal employees, including members of the military. To help clear it up, I recently dropped by the offices of Christopher Nunneveller, a veteran military lawyer who currently represents federal and military personnel on a wide variety of matters. Nunneveller's experience includes work on the wake of the Abu Ghraib scandal and the first Fort Hood shooting, and service as an associate director for the Military Compensation and Retirement Modernization Commission. Listen as we talk about leaking and whistleblowing and how they differ from internal reporting of concerns within established channels, and what federal employees and military members especially need to know about all three. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
So the topic of whistleblowing, or leaking if you will, or if they are indeed the same thing or not, is one that's been very on the mind of people, I would say, recently, in the sense that Donald Trump, as president, since he's become president, has spoken a great deal about his concerns about whistleblowers, leakers, in fact indicated that he feels that they are a key way of undermining national security, perhaps even undermining him politically. But that's not a new thing. I remember that President Obama was very aggressive with leakers. And I know that the retort was often, they're not a leaker, they're a whistleblower. So I think maybe before we talk about this any further, if you could give me a sense of what is a leaker, what is a whistleblower? Is there a difference? Does it matter?
There's a difference between whistleblowing and leaking. Whistleblowing is a legal concept in such that government employees are given protections for when they leak official agency information. Leaking is more of a political or entertainment concept where somebody has information that gives them a political or financial personal gain is more like it. So there are differences, and in the era of Donald Trump, I think his mind of leaking is more of a Hollywood leaking than it is of a official Washington leaking or a legal concept for him.
So would it be accurate to say that leaking itself is not a legal concept? That you can whistleblow through a leak, but a leak itself is not a legal concept. It's a way of understanding a transfer of information that perhaps isn't authorized or is non-traditional? Well,
leaking in its traditional sense is more of a Hollywood concept, but leaking is whistleblowing depending on what you're leaking. If I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency and I wanted to leak the fact that there was lead in New York City's water, but the government I thought was covering it up and leaked it, that would be whistleblowing.
So as I understand what you're saying, leaking is almost really two things. It's a concept. It's a popularly understood concept, which is, as you said, maybe a Hollywood understanding, but it's also a potential method. Is this every captain is a soldier, but not every soldier is a captain situation? You can leak to whistleblow something, but you can also leak just to leak.
Correct.
Got it. I would also say that, judging by both whether it's President Obama or President Trump or any number of people who characterize or respond to leaks or whistleblowing here in this town, that one of the things that they say is the intensity of the response seems to be in the eye of the beholder. Would you agree that there is a functional difference? Leaking is bad. Leaking is worse when it benefits someone. I mean, we all know that people leak intentionally in this town. How do you sort of navigate this idea that a leak, that the concept of a leak or how damaging it is, or whether it is or is not whistleblowing, is subjective?
It's completely subjective. Leaking is, like I said, more of a political maneuver. So therefore, the more upset somebody gets, the more upset that somebody gets that something got leaked, the more it is not that important. So, for example, Donald Trump's tax returns. Everybody knew they were going to come out. It was a big deal, but in reality, it really wasn't a big deal. It was more political hype than it was anything.
And I think that actually that example is great because it highlights something else, which is just because someone calls something legal, illegal, permissible, impermissible, constitutional, unconstitutional, a violation of some sort, or a public service, that's also part of that subjective characterization. There are legal understandings of various actions, and we'll get to those in a second. But moving forward, it's important to understand that just because someone calls something illegal or says something is inappropriate, that's not always true, is it?
No, everybody uses the word legal or illegal in a very loose term when we lawyers believe that it is a very specific and distinct thing. But everybody, the Hollywood says, "Ooh, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's whatever." And when in reality, it's necessarily illegal. It just depends on the characterization. You don't know that until you dig into the facts.
So in understanding this differentiation between whistleblowing as a specific legal concept and leaking as a more generalized concept that can be interpreted several different ways, what do we need to know about whistleblowing?
Well, whistleblowing itself is a concept of releasing agency information you're not supposed to. The real question you've got to understand is whether or not the person who's blowing the whistle actually has protections, and that's the most important thing. So to get the protections of the Whistleblower Protection Act, you need to have a covered employee, which is basically a government employee, releases information, and then the agency takes some sort of retaliatory action against them. If those three things get met, then there's whistleblower protection.
So we've established that whistleblowing and leaking are very different things conceptually and legally. One of the things that I understand is that there are protections for whistleblowers, which in a way seems counterintuitive to me. Why do we have protections for whistleblowers, and what does that mean, whistleblower protection?
We have whistleblower protections because the government, unfortunately, does things it really shouldn't be doing. So employees morally, ethically feel as though they need to leak these things or reveal them to the public or reveal them to someone. And the people who are committing those illegal acts obviously don't want to get caught and want to protect themselves in what we used to call in the Department of Defense, protecting their rice bowl. So if an employee makes a disclosure of apparently illegal activities, the government, Congress, has provided protections for those whistleblowers, and those protections are: you can't take the agency cannot take retaliatory acts, can't retaliate against you. So to make sure that you have the protections, you've got to meet the standard to get that protection. That protection is that you have to be a covered employee. You have to make a protected disclosure, which means the disclosure was actually something important, and that the agency took action against you.
So one thing I heard you say there's a call to be made in terms of whistleblowing, both on the whistleblower side and the government side, which is whether this conduct, whether this information being leaked or that one might think about leaking is actually illegal or immoral or unethical. And I can imagine people might have different takes on that. You've seen that in the president's response, both Obama and Trump and others before them. Many different agencies might have different takes on whether that interpretation is the same. So when you first start does it make a difference legally if you sincerely believe what you're saying is wrong? Does your intent, does the reason you're leaking come into play as from a legal standpoint?
The intent matters. That's an element of all crime. However, the legal intent and the moral intent are two different things.
What do you mean?
So legal intent is, did I intend to actually leak the information? Did I give information A to person B? That's legal intent. The intent to leak on a moral basis is, this is important. I really need to get in Flint's water. I need to let people know that. So there's a difference between legal intent and moral intent. What's my intent of letting that information out? Not that I actually intended to give the piece of paper to the reporter.
So for the purposes of determining whether a crime occurred, the intent to do so, it's not an accidental disclosure is what you're saying. That way, an accidental disclosure would be very different from an intentional disclosure of information.
And a legal intent would mean I intended to hand these documents to that reporter. That's the legal, not the content of the papers, but the fact that I handed those papers is legal intent. Moral intent is these papers contain evidence that there's lead in Flint's water. So therefore, morally, I really want to give this to the reporter to let it out. So this moral intent is much more fungible, much more subjective.
So one could see how moral intent could impact a jury or perhaps even a judge's perception. Is it maybe even an investigator or a commander in the military's perception of how far they want to go with a prosecution or investigation of this? As a pure legal matter, does your moral intent factor in, or is that something that happens on the human side of the equation?
That happens on the human side of the equation. The law is very specific for a very reason. They want to make sure they have the same standard every time you do it. So legal intent again is you intended to hand those papers to that person, not what was in the papers, but the actual papers.
Does it matter if something is those of us who worked in the government are very familiar with their levels of classification? Does it ultimately matter in terms of culpability once you move beyond something that is public and unclassified, whether something was simply for official use only or whether something was top secret?
Well, it definitely matters. If it's confidential to top secret to above top secret, that's classified information, and it's illegal to disclose classified information, even if it's confidential.
So that's governed under different laws entirely.
Correct. For official use only isn't a classification. It's merely protected information. So PI, personally identifiable information, is for official use only. But it's not illegal under classification standards to disclose that. It's a different set of standards.
There might be different regulations, different standards, personal information, HIPAA, agency rules and regulations. So talk a little bit, because I think what most people deal with on a regular basis, unless they are in a particularly sensitive job or dealing with a specific topic, is FOIA or whatever the agency variation of that, which is, for official use only, which often I think we've all been in situations where somebody goes back after you've been working on something in a while and says, oh, you know what, go slap FOIA on that. Let's make sure just protect ourselves and make sure we've marked it for official use only. What does that mean in terms of whether this is someone's legal situation, whether that can be shared?
Well, the fact that something is marked for official use only doesn't mean it can't be disclosed officially. The Freedom of Information Act allows information to be disclosed, and there's only 6 or 7 different denial reasons that things can be disclosed. If you can't get it in one of those denial authorities, then it has to be released. And the only reason FOUO is basically to say, hey, we need to look at this a little bit closer. It's not a guarantee against disclosure.
So again, this isn't something that per se that a potential or would-be whistleblower can make the call on their own, but it is important for someone to be aware of.
Absolutely. Obviously, the higher the classification, the more damaging the information theoretically is.
That makes sense. Is there a relationship between the ethical and moral obligation and the legal right to share something? For example, I grew up and have worked in the military a very long time, and I'm very aware of the idea that a soldier is obligated to not follow an illegal order. Is there an obligation government employees share to report or to reveal or to expose illegal behavior? And what happens when it's simply immoral behavior, unethical behavior?
So all government employees have an obligation and a requirement to tell their superiors or the inspector general of illegal activity. If I know that a government agency is deliberately dumping chemicals into the Potomac River, I have an obligation to tell the police department, the Department of Justice, the EPA, the inspector general that that's happening. The difference between is whether or not it's a whistleblower is whether or not that information is so sensitive that you can't report it to someone else because it's too highly classified or too secret or something like that. So that's when the whistleblower comes in. It's like, if I tell Congress, what's going to happen.
So it sounds to me that you're saying there are official channels, and those should not necessarily be ignored, that there are methods, at least in most agencies, all agencies, to report bad behavior, and even beyond that within the government.
Right. I think the distinction is this, is that if you know something is illegal happening and you report it to the IG or you report it to the Department of Justice or you report it to your superiors and nothing happens, that's when a whistleblower takes action to say, you know what, the government isn't acting on this. Let's make them take action. Let's report it to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times.
So what you see most often then is whistleblowing as a forcing function.
For the most part. Some people feel as though that's the only way they can get it because they know if they give it to their boss, the boss is going to brush it under the table or the agency is going to brush it under the table.
And it seems to me there might be a consideration perhaps that if I report it, nothing happens, and then it shows up in the Washington Post, people will know that it was me.
Right. I think there's a couple examples from the past that really work. Let's use Abu Ghraib. The things that were happening inside Abu Ghraib were arguably quote unquote legal because the government sanctioned it. When in reality, morally, we don't want to do torture. And there's an argument to be said that the commanders of Abu Ghraib knew that this behavior by Grainer and Lindy England were ongoing, and they allowed it to happen. But morally, we want to let the world know that the government is actually sanctioning torture and all this other kind of activity. So that's where a whistleblower comes into effect. He met the person who disclosed it, and I don't know, is whether or not he tried to report it to CID or the IG or his commanders, and they'd ignored him, and he decided, I'm going to take action in my own hands, and leaked it out. And then we got the Abu Ghraib scandal. Same thing with Walter Reed. Many commanders and leadership knew that the barracks in Walter Reed were in really bad shape and soldiers were being treated badly, but they did nothing about it. How do you force that? You put it on the front page of the Washington Post. That's whistleblowing.
So I guess we should start at the beginning. By no means am I trying to provide a blueprint for how someone should whistleblow or leak, because that's a very specific decision, specific to the circumstances. And I want to make it clear, I don't want to speak for you, but I want to make it clear that we're not providing legal advice as to what one should do or how they should do it.
Absolutely not.
But I think probably a good question would be if there's something that's getting at you that you feel is unethical or immoral or illegal, where do you start making the decision what the right path is, whether it's an official reporting channel or going to Congress or going to the Washington Post? I mean, how do you even begin to assess whether your perception, how do you do a reality check on that?
Well, let me put this into perspective, I think. There are figures out there that say as many as 98% of the Merit System Protection Board cases that go to the board for adjudication because an agency retaliated against an employee, 98% of those cases are found in the form of on behalf of the government. 98% of whistleblowers lose their cases because they didn't meet the legal standard. So the reality of it is, if you think you're going to leak information, or you want to leak it, or you think it's important, number one, what you think is important may not be really important in the grand scheme of the world. So my best advice, and it's not a personal plug or for my profession, is find a lawyer. Talk to them and ask them. They're an independent person who you can speak to freely because of the attorney-client privilege. What do you think I should do with it? If I do it, what's going to happen to me? If I do it, what's going to happen to the person about I'm leaking? Get some independent advice.
It's funny because I think a lot of people view getting a lawyer as kind of the last step, as the last resort when I'm ready to go out guns blazing. You're making kind of a different point, which I find very interesting, and of course is informed by all your experience doing just these sorts of things, which is a lawyer might be the first person you talk to. Why not my wife?
Oh, you definitely don't want to talk to her. You don't want to talk to anybody outside that you don't have a privilege, because your best friend might not exactly be your best friend that you think he is. He may take that information for his own gain and do something with it.
That's a very good point. While your wife can't testify against you, your coworker that you're sitting there going, hey, this thing that's happening, do you think I should report it? They absolutely can be called in by an agency investigator and say, did he talk to you about doing this? And they say, yeah, Ben said do that, and he was going to do it.
Plus, the other thing is when you talk to your wife or you talk to your best friend, they're not lawyers. They may not be lawyers. They may not have experience in these sorts of things, and they may give you the wrong advice and send you down a road that you can't recover from.
So not everybody has access to you, although we can provide that information if someone would like it. How would you go about selecting? I mean, do I call that guy who says 1-800 injury, get your insurance payments now, because every lawyer can do this? What should I be looking for in a lawyer who might be able to give me advice on if I'm in the IRS office in Austin? Well,
my opinion is you need to find somebody with whom you can have a good rapport and you think you can trust. That's the most important thing. You've got to be able to have honest conversations and know that lawyer has got your best interests at heart.
So what's the ideal lawyer to give you this advice? If you'd tell us a little bit about the kind of resume that you have or the kind of resume that lawyers similar to you, the background might have in terms of interpreting federal statutes or having worked. What should someone be looking for to get that kind of advice?
Well, the question, I think, you could get the Hollywood lawyer of the world who wants to get out there in front of the papers and say, look at poor Johnny. He released this information, but he did it for a good reason. What's the motivation of the lawyer? Is the motivation to get you the best protection under the law, or is that motivation to raise their profile? That's one thing you should consider. The second thing, the other motivation you consider is whether or not, hey, are you aligned with one party or the other? Is there a motivation for that particular firm to raise its profile, or does it have an agenda that it's following to say, well, we want to spin it, or we want to spin it this way, or we want to spin it that way, and it takes away from the information you've got?
That's a really good point. I'd like to stop that there for a second. I think we've all seen that play out in various ways. The Hollywood lawyers, and believe me, here in D.C. we have our own version of the Hollywood lawyer, or the lawyer who is known, for better or worse, to be dogged in this thing, or to have an agenda to want to hold a certain agency or a certain party accountable. And should something proceed beyond the advice stage, do you think people realize sometimes that sort of the reputation or the characteristics of their representation can color their...
Absolutely. My recommendation for finding a lawyer is find one that actually, again, has your interests at heart, but also, in my opinion, should be low key. His job is to protect you. That's his ultimate goal. And how is he going to go about doing that? There are times when you should be in front of the cameras, and there are times you need to find a lawyer who can work the back halls of Congress or the back halls of the agency. It depends. That's why you just try and find one guy and talk to him. Or, get advice from somebody who maybe works in Washington or New York or Philadelphia or LA or wherever you think you're going to do this, and talk to that lawyer. You don't have to talk to the first guy. You can talk to the 10th guy if you want.
You're listening to the BZcast. I'm Benjamin Bryant. My guest is attorney Christopher Nunneveller, a former military lawyer who now represents military and federal employees on a variety of matters. I visited Christopher in his offices recently to better understand the legal concepts behind one of the most debated, but perhaps least understood, topics in all of Washington: leaking. Join us as we continue our conversation. So it sounds like a lawyer can play two different functions. A lawyer can, of course, represent and navigate this process, particularly if there's retaliation, help prepare you and understand your rights. But she might also give you advice to say, hey, this isn't, in my opinion, really rise to the legal standard that you would receive maximum protections as a whistleblower, or there are other channels already in your agency that might do that. So she's giving you this kind of advice. She can be your gut check before it even gets to those things.
Right. I mean, a lawyer is a good person. If you think they're throwing chemicals into the Potomac or into the Delaware or into the Hudson, then you go talk to a lawyer and say, this is what I think I want to do. And the lawyer can help you navigate. Well, have you reported to the DIG? Have you reported it to the police? Have you reported to the EPA? And those lawyers can help you navigate those things to basically check all the boxes. So if it ever comes to the point where the agency's ignoring you, then they know, okay, well, we're going to take it up a level. Maybe we need to go in front of the cameras. Maybe we need to go to the New York Times and release this. But they're the best ones who can help you take the emotion out of it and make it work for you, and to get the information out and protect you at the same time.
Okay, so do you even need to go out and find one? I mean, I know that most agencies and many sub-agencies have general counsel, on site, have lawyers that are there who know the agencies and know the agency's procedures really, really well. I mean, should they be your first stop?
I would recommend against it, because government lawyers, the role of the government lawyer is to protect that agency. If it has knowledge that there's an illegal act coming, number one, it has an obligation to report it. But that doesn't protect you from having told the lawyer that the agency can't do something against you. Now, while legally they're not allowed to do that, that doesn't mean practically they won't do it. You sue them, and 6 years later you win. You still have to go through the heartache of all that time and all that effort and energy and lawyers' fees to get that money back or that promotion, but it's still 6 years from now.
So, Chris, one of the things I think that you're saying that's quite interesting, and it references back something you brought up at the top, is that there is this Hollywood idea of leaking, this romantic idea of the hero who's exposing wrongdoing and making the world a better place. But there are real world costs and potential risks to the leaker and or whistleblower, no matter how noble their endeavor. And when that nobility is subjective or questionable, it can become kind of a mess. I imagine that's something you need to take into account before making your decision as to how to move forward.
Think about Edward Snowden. Some people believe that he did a good and moral thing by letting the world know that the government had the capability of spying on them. But look at his life. He had to escape from the country, lives in Russia, makes no money, separated from his family and friends. Now, 15 years from now, he might be successful and they'll pardon him and he'll come back and live his life and be a celebrity. But right now, his life is, I'm sure, hell. Think about Bradley Manning. Different set of circumstances, but again, he did it for a variety of reasons. But look at what happened to him. I mean, his life is hell.
So let me ask this. Does it matter what agency you're coming out of, where this is either happening or where you work? Because I can imagine the situation for a military person seeing something that they believe is immoral, unethical, or illegal might be governed by a different set of regulations or rules than, say, someone at the EPA.
Well, number one, if you're in the military, you have a second layer of legal requirements on top of you. You're governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but that doesn't mean you can't violate another statute that isn't under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So the question then becomes is if you think or you are in the military, you're another Chelsea Manning of the world, and you want to leak something or disclose required information, you could go to the local trial defense counsel or legal assistance lawyer. But then they also have an obligation to release information, theoretically, that if it's damaging to the government, they have an obligation to tell somebody. Why put that lawyer in that ethical quandary? Number one, he or she does not have the bandwidth to do that. They don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to push all my other clients to a different side to handle this one case. They have to handle a lot of people at one time. They're not going to be able to dedicate to you the time that's necessary to help you solve the problem, particularly when you're trying to hurt their particular employer at the same time.
So let's step back. You haven't decided yet that you want to leak something or that it even rises to that level, but you are curious, for example, what are my options for official reporting of something? Would that be something that your legal assistance office, your uniform legal, because they do know the regulations? Or are you throwing up a red flag saying, hey, I might be leaking something?
I think personally, while legally no, practically yes. The answer you really want is you want to get somebody that's unbiased outside the system. Find a civilian lawyer that has previous experience in the area in which you want. Somebody like me who is a former Army judge advocate who understands the system but isn't obligated to necessarily defend it or protect it.
And that's true too. While maybe not everywhere in the country, certainly here in Washington and certainly in around sort of the major centers of government, there are quite a few people who have been in these agencies, who have worked in these agencies, and now are in private practice, who can provide sound advice and an interpretation, an understanding of how the government writes and interprets these laws, these regulations, these statutes, while at the same time providing the protections that you speak of in terms of being your lawyer.
Right, absolutely. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of former assistant United States attorneys out there who prosecuted crimes and now work for private firms. They are in the perfect position to be able to help you defend against white-collar crime, securities fraud, dumping chemicals in the Delaware River, for example.
So you make a good point there. You talked about white-collar crime. So, again, I'm in the IRS office in Austin, Texas, and I open up the phone book to lawyers, and I find a bunch. Help me narrow it down. Am I looking for someone who is a white-collar crime defense lawyer? Am I looking for someone who's a criminal defense lawyer, period? Am I looking for someone who is, represents companies in cases for against the federal government? What kind of lawyer am I looking for again?
That's a really good and a really hard question to answer, because lawyers, they don't necessarily advertise the thing that you are specifically looking for. So you've got to look for somebody who has experience in the agency in which you're working, and then research their reputation. Look on firms like Avvo or Martindale-Hubbell or the local bar association. They'll be able to give you advice as to say, hey, I've got this issue. Which lawyers give you that? And then you have to start having conversation with them. All lawyers, most lawyers, give you an hour worth of free consultation where you can at least go in. You have the protection of the attorney-client privilege. You can say, say, this is what I'm doing. What do you think? And they'll say, hey, maybe we can help you, and this is what I would suggest you do if you retain us. Other ones, you're going to get an instantaneous personality. They're, and I hate to say this about other lawyers, they're an ambulance chaser. You just got to find that one lawyer, and it's going to take time.
One more question about legality. It seems to me that in order to be able to leak something or blow the whistle on something that even the most hard-hearted interpreter would say, yeah, this was bad, you might have to acquire or disseminate information compounding the exposure you have criminally. Is this when you get the bare minimum and give it to the Washington Post and let them run with it? Or do you do what Chelsea Manning did, which was access thousands and thousands and thousands of documents, some of which are relevant and some of which weren't, and turn them all over?
Well,
legally, is there a difference?
There's no legal difference. You turn over one document, you turn over 100 documents. It's the difference between one count of leaking or 100 counts of whistleblowing. The problem you're going to have on the other side is, again, it's the same thing is judging whether or not the thing you're trying to leak is important enough. You may have to go to 100 reporters to get them to pique their interest, and you're going to disclose it 100 times, which theoretically, if they catch you doing that, and you do that, it's 100 counts of leaking information. So you've got to have a head on your shoulders and just think about it, about what you're doing.
I can imagine that's where the lawyer comes in handy. From my background as a reporter and then in PR, I could tell you, that you'd want to research the right reporter to make sure you maximize your thing there. But as I said, we're not trying to give a tutorial here
right.
on how to leak something. We offer no advice whatsoever here as to whether you should be leaking something or how. But at the same time, let's look at it a little bit differently. What if you think you have done something? What if you know you had something? What if you leaked something some time ago, and you're not sure where you stand right now? Is that something a lawyer can help you with now, or Absolutely. Are you kind of on your own?
Absolutely. You need to, if you think you've done something wrong and you think the Department of Justice can come after you, you should go to a lawyer and say, this is what I've done or what I think I've done. What are my ramifications? The lawyer has an absolute protection of that information and can't do anything with it. So you can be open and honest, and he or she's going to be open and honest with you and tell you what the risks are. And that's what you really need to understand is, what are your risks? Statute of limitations may expire after 3, 5, 7 years, and you no longer have a risk.
What else can a lawyer do? Can a lawyer, for example, serve as your intermediary? Can they be the person who kind of goes out there? So you disclose once and they go out there and do that? Is that an ethical thing to ask of your lawyer?
That is something you can definitely talk to your lawyer about. If you know you have information about somebody dumping chemicals or the EPA is dumping chemicals into the Potomac River or the Delaware River, you should absolutely go to your lawyer and say, look, I want to disclose this information, but obviously I don't want to get fired. The lawyer could, depending on his experience, may go to the EPA and say, I have information that something bad's going on here. Either you fix it or we're going to do something with it.
So this is the argument here for getting a smart lawyer who knows their agency, knows what they're doing, maybe knows their way around Washington. Because it's funny, isn't it? It doesn't really matter if you're in that IRS office in Austin. They're all Washington problems, aren't they?
They all end up being Washington problems. I mean, yes, you may be dumping chemicals into the Delaware River in Philadelphia, but if it gets on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, it's going to end up in Washington somehow, and then it takes on a completely different character, different intensity.
Including in how an agency might want to respond to
Absolutely.
you. It's now no longer an administrator locally saying, well, we were doing that, are bad. It could be someone in Washington saying, this does not work for us politically, or this is an issue that I want to politically sponsor, that then takes on a life of its own.
Think about the Department of Veterans Affairs, where the whole veteran care thing has started in Phoenix. That was a local problem. Nobody took care of it locally. It then came to Washington, and now look what's happened to it.
And now the people involved have national profiles.
Correct. They're now on the front page of the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine.
Can you characterize it this time? Something that just shouldn't be leaked. I mean, there are times, I think, when we all see things and we all, get our Irish up about whether or not this is something that should be done or we didn't like. Are there some times when, look, I understand you're upset, but this is not the kind of thing that rises to putting yourself at risk? I mean, are there situations where you just shouldn't leak, where whistleblowing is not the right answer?
Well, whistleblowing is not the right answer when it's a personal matter where things are happening in the office that shouldn't go. Remember, the standard for whistleblowing protection is where an employee believes that the government has doing something that's grossly mismanaged or a gross waste of funds or an abuse of authority, or there's a substantial or specific danger to public health and safety. Those are the things. Edward Snowden theoretically leaking information that says the United States government is spying on American citizens, where soldiers are being treated badly, where we're torturing foreign citizens to get information.
So I think what you're saying is interesting because we often tend to leak, at least in terms of popular understanding, all of these famous leakers and whistleblowers together, when in reality they're very different cases and may take on different characters based on the circumstances and the motivation. And you have someone like Snowden who believed a gross act of malfeasance was occurring and felt the people needed to know, and whether or not that is the case, we've not yet been able to adjudicate, but that was certainly the feeling, and therefore took one action. And you've got someone like Manning, who Joe was feeling under a lot of emotional and personal stress, and was very unhappy with the situation and the way the environment was when he was there, and therefore took the actions he did, partially as a result of that. Those are different things. Perhaps there might have been other ways, other avenues.
So there is, I think, a distinct difference between Manning and Snowden. Snowden leaked information because he believed the government was spying on United States citizens, or at least had that capability. Manning did it because he was feeling personally persecuted. The other difference between Manning and Snowden is Manning released it for personal gain. He didn't release any information that said we did anything wrong. He just released information that would be embarrassing.
And that's a good point. Releasing something that is embarrassing to the government is very different than releasing something that says the government is doing something illegal.
Absolutely.
It may be personally satisfying if you are upset or you have a personal concern.
One of Manning's motivations may have been, and we don't know for sure and we'll never know, one of his motivations may have been he wanted to embarrass the government by saying, hey, look, we're spying on the Germans, or we're spying on the Brits, or we're spying on the Japanese.
Did you know we're doing all of these things?
Right. Which is not per se illegal. It's intelligence we're gathering to make sure that we're able to give the best advice to the president or act in our best interests.
So it's interesting. In both cases, you might argue that it forced changes in how we do things, or it caused us to look at things differently, or change our procedures. But one came out of the idea that, look, I genuinely believe something is going wrong here, and I genuinely believe the only way that this information can be disseminated and fully discussed and engaged with is if it is put out in the public.
Right. Again, you want to make sure that you've tried to report this through the regular agency channels to report fraud, waste, and abuse.
And it is not enough, say, going back to, and again, we don't know all the details, but it would not be enough to simply say, hey, I think it's wrong that the government is doing this, even though it might be legal, and your superiors don't follow up on that, and so therefore you think I'm going to take it to the thing. The government does have a case when you've released something that was supposed to be secret for no purpose other than you don't agree with it.
Correct.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. I think we've actually learned a lot. It's been something that is going to be on the front page, I suspect, for a long time as we navigate the new normal of how we talk about these things and what these words mean in terms of popular culture and these kinds of things. I appreciate it. It's been great talking to you.
It's been great talking to you, too.
The BZ Cast is a production of the Brian Zammerlin Group as part of the independently funded Brian Zammerlin Media Project. Our producer is Tommy Zammerlin, and our support team includes Daniel Bachman, Beverly George, and Andrea Buckley. Special thanks to them and all of the BZ family. Our theme music is composed by Jason Shaw of Audionautics. That's Audionautics with an X. Check out more of their work at audionautics.com. I'm Benjamin Bryant, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter at BZBenBryant. Thank you for listening to the BZ Cast, where all rights, as always, are reserved.